It's episode number 53 of This Week in Creationism. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and we take a look at the recent headlines in the world of creationism. We've got a couple responses to the big Homo naledi news from earlier this week. We've got Ken Ham very upset at the use of the word evolve in a story about red kangaroos in Australia. We're looking at young earth creationist response to the Yucatan meteor, including one individual who's written what I think is a very excellent article discussing the evidence for a meteorite impact on Earth at the Yucatan Peninsula. We got that and a few more things coming right up. Let's get right to the headline on the Answers in Genesis website right now. Is Australia's dingo fence driving kangaroos to evolve? And Ken Ham, in his blog post, and also on the Answers News program that ran that same day, they discuss this dingo fence and how red kangaroos are supposedly evolving. And of course, what they're upset about is the use of the word evolve. Let me show you. As he says here, this is Ken Ham's blog, not written by Ken Ham, but by his team of writers. And a quote from the article. Let me just go back here for a moment. I need to say something about this. I've pointed this out in the past, but it's worth pointing out again. It just kind of blows me away. Out of all the different popular news sites, science news sites, Answers in Genesis seems to consistently go to this particular site to grab headlines and reports of research. And this particular site, IFL Science, I don't know if does Ken Ham understand what IFL stands for? What that's an acronym for? Do people at Answers in Genesis understand that's IFN like science? There are many other websites, but I don't understand why he is linking and supporting a website and constantly reading a website with that kind of terminology, vulgar terminology, in the title. It just doesn't seem consistent with the rest of his rest of what he expects, from his viewers. Anyway, story in IFL Science, of which I'm sure that he could have found this story in multiple other sites as well, but for some reason chooses IFL Science in order to highlight. And you'll see the article that is there, and this is at the top of Ken Ham's blog post. Dingo-proof fence could be driving astonishingly fast kangaroo evolution. Now, he actually, I think, likes the words astonishingly fast because Answers in Genesis and other young earth creationists want to have their cake and eat it too, right? They want to say that evolution doesn't happen, but evolution happens at an astonishing pace. Microevolution, Changes within kinds can happen incredibly fast. They need it to happen incredibly fast because they think that 2 dogs got off the ark and then turned into 35 different species of dogs within just a few thousand years. And so there's this. I want to support this kind of evidence, but I also want to warn the audience that they're misapplying the term evolution. So here we see a quote at the very top from the article itself. In a new study, they raised the possibility that within just a few decades, the kangaroos have evolved, there's the word evolved, not to hurry their growth to get big enough to escape their main predator. Dingoes are one of their main predators, carnivore in Australia, that attacks red kangaroos. Now, red kangaroos live on both sides of the dingo fence. And of course, what the dingo fence is this really long fence across the middle of Australia, an attempt to keep dingoes out of large portions of Australia, or at least keep the populations down. And so there is definitely a population density difference on either side of the fence of dingoes. And you might expect that if there are more predators on one side of the fence than the other, that's going to affect the population of the prey, which is red kangaroos, amongst other things like rabbits and so forth. Okay, so now what's Ken Ham's comment here? Or his writing team's comment, really. But is this really evolution? Is this really evolution? See, they're calling this evolution. But is it really evolution? Well, no, because kangaroos remain kangaroos, They didn't change into something else. His definition of evolution is it has to change into something completely different for you to call something evolution. No genetic information has been created. Again, my last video on the misconceptions of Answers in Genesis about what is involved in evolution and what their definition of evolution is and how it's different than natural selection. They suggest that new genetic information has to be created for evolution to happen. No changes in kind happened as they remain the kangaroo kind. Rather, we're seeing the effects of natural selection. I agree, right? Natural selection is a process. It's a mechanism of how changes occur in populations, which is the generic word evolution. Interestingly, and this was interesting, the first popular science the first popular science article I mentioned references, right? He's talking about the IFL Science article, references evolution several times, and yet a keyword search for evolution in the article, the actual journal article itself, turns up nothing, right? There is no mention of the actual term evolution in the original science article, original journal article. I double-checked that for him, and it's true. There is no mention of the word, specifically the word evolution. Of course, they use the word natural selection, the other mechanisms of evolution, but they don't specifically use the word evolution. What's happening here is that the popular science article is writing very generically, all right, for an audience that doesn't know technical terms, right? And the word evolution just is, it's used in the sense of its very generic meaning of just change, right? That organisms are changing, that they are adapting to their environments. The environment changes, there's more dingoes, fewer dingoes. There's more vegetation, less vegetation as a result of interactions with dingoes in their environment. And as a result, organisms are being selected for different natural history traits and therefore changing the features of those populations on either side of that fence. That is evolution. Right? It's just a simple way, it's a simple word to use, and it's not improper for this general science popularizing these articles to use the word evolution. So this isn't a shocker that the original article doesn't actually use the word evolution itself. It's actually describing a bunch of mechanisms of evolution. In fact, it's describing parts of evolution without actually using this broader term. Again, this is just selection pressure impacting a population. But it's not any kind of change. What do you mean, not any kind of change? Of course it's a kind of change, right? If selection is causing there to be different features, different characteristics of red kangaroo populations. The red kangaroo populations on one side of the fence definitely have characteristics that are different than the red kangaroos on the other side of the fence, right? Consistent within their populations. And that wasn't always the case prior to the fence. So therefore, a change in the environment on either side of the fence has resulted in an actual change in the appearance and the life history traits of these kangaroos. By life history traits, I mean lifespans, sex ratios, size of the animals, and so forth, right? All those things are statistically different on either side of the fence. All right, so there is a kind of change. It's just variation with the population due to already existing genetic information. I agree. The article that he apparently searched to look for the word evolution talks about just that. They're not claiming that these organisms have changed into other types of organisms, and they're not claiming they've even come up with new genetic material. They're claiming that they have been selected for different traits on either side of the fence. So this isn't evolution in a molecules to animal sense. Well, okay, right. I mean, but that's Ken Ham thinks that you can only use this term evolution if you're talking about the process of making a bacteria into a human being. As if you look at the process any step along the way and be able to see that there was something different going on than what's happening today in front of our very own eyes. Yes, there's variation within the kangaroo kind, but kangaroos only produce more kangaroos. Don't let attention-grabbing headlines meant to brainwash you with evolutionary ideas fool you. I don't think there's any brainwashing going on here. The person who wrote this article is simply framing the article in this is really interesting that there are variants on either side of this fence that are caused by mechanisms of that change the genetics on either side of the fence. And what else are we going to call that? You call it change. You call it evolution, right? They're not saying, oh, if we can get people to believe in that these two kangaroos on either side of the fence have changed a little bit, well, then obviously they're going to accept molecules to man evolution. You accept that changes happen, all right? Here's the original article. Differential development rates and demographics in red kangaroo populations separated by the dingo barrier fence. The article is really, all it is it's making a lot of observations, and then they draw some inferences from what they're seeing, and it's essentially a study and a report of what they found in terms of the differences on either side of the fence, and a suggestion for what needs to be studied further, because it turns out this is probably a really complicated situation. Let me read just a tiny bit of the abstract and we'll move on. Decommissioning the dingo barrier fence has been suggested to reduce destructive dingo control and encourage a free transfer of biota between environments in Australia. The dingo fence was made in order to control dingoes, but unfortunately, if you have a large fence that spans hundreds of miles, right, or thousands of kilometers, I guess, that stops not just dingoes from passing over, but it also prevents red kangaroos from interacting with other members of their own population and lots of other animals, right? And so you're preventing gene flow. When you prevent gene flow, you cause lots of unintended consequences, and it's probably not the most healthy situation. The potential impacts over a century of predatory exclusion might have had on the population dynamics and developmental biology of prey populations has not been assessed. All right, they're saying we haven't really looked to see what are the results of our past decisions, right? We as humans made decisions about, like, here's a way we can control this one thing. Of course, Australia is famous for having tried to fix a lot of problems, and things not going very well, right? So we need to look at this. We just need to collect some data. So here they look at demographic data and some morphometrics. And that's the shape of in fact, this is the shape of the cranium in this case, to assess differences in populations among 166 red kangaroos, the primary prey species of the dingo, from two isolated populations on either side of the fence. So, right, got two populations, one on one side of the fence, one on the other. Let's take a look at them. We quantified the differences in above ground vegetation biomass for the last 10 years on either side of the fence. So you might be wondering, like, wide measure of vegetation on either side. Well, there's a lot of interaction effects potentially going on with removal of dingoes or reduction of numbers of dingoes, right? If you have a lot of dingoes, you might have fewer herbivores. If you have fewer herbivores, you'll have more plants on one side. Whereas if you had more dingoes, right, or I'm sorry, fewer dingoes, you've got more herbivores surviving and probably growing to larger sizes and living longer. That's actually what they observed. And therefore, they're eating more vegetation. So there's going to be less vegetation on this side. Of course, if there's less vegetation, then there's also a pressure on the populations of the herbivores not to survive as well, too, right? So it gets really, really complicated. And that's why usually there aren't going to be really straightforward answers to these types of questions, because organisms are all interacting with each other in very complicated fashions. We found that the age structure and growth patterns, but not cranial shape, differed between the two kangaroo populations. In the population living with a higher density of dingoes, there were relatively fewer males and juveniles. So fewer males and juveniles if there were more dingoes. All right, the dingoes were successful at getting young and females, and males therefore had to grow faster in order to survive in that particular environment. All right, so there's different selective pressures is the whole point of this on either side of the fence, and that results in different selection of different individuals in these populations based on the characteristics they have that either help them survive in an environment with dingoes or help them survive better, give an advantage in an environment without dingoes. And therefore, their genetics are changing over time. So there's probably, they didn't look at the genetics in this case, but you would infer that the genetics of these populations, it's heritable because these populations have undergone many years, right, at least 17 generations to get to this point. And they are sharing that genetic information with their offspring, and therefore it's heritable variation that's been selected, right? So natural selection occurring. And therefore the population structure is changing. Those two populations have changed. So they have evolved, they have changed. It's not inappropriate to use that particular generic word to say, They're evolving, right? They're changing. Let's move on. Okay, now, Answers in Genesis, a couple days ago, actually on June 5th, the day that the big announcement came out by Lee Berger and a variety of colleagues, in which he announced the new findings about Homo naledi, right? These enigmatic fossils from South Africa, from the Rising Star cave. And it was announced that they had found evidence of burial in the caves, evidence of markings on the walls, intentional markings on the walls, which they proposed could have been made by the individuals, by Homo naledi individuals. And they found a potential stone tool in a burial site itself, right? This made a huge splash, and I did a whole nother video about this, and I made some predictions about how young Earth creationists would respond. So that very day I saw this particular article, Neanderthals, do they practice chemistry? Okay, this is not about Homo naledi. But what was interesting is that Answers in Genesis had this very incredible discovery. Like this was their YouTube version of their Answers in News cover, right? And it's on the day that the Homo naledi news was released. I think this is just happenstance. I don't think there's anything nefarious here. I don't think Answers in Genesis is like, oh boy, there's this big news. Let's distract our viewers from that news by putting out this big news about. It's easy to see how. People might come to Answers in Genesis and they've heard there's some news in paleontology, and then they say Answers in Genesis has incredible discovery and here's our response to it. But it's not a response to the big news. This is a response to some news from like a couple weeks ago about Homo naledi, and it's some evidence that they potentially were able to make glue from birch trees, right? Which requires some processing. And so that suggests sort of a higher cognitive and social structure in order to be able to do this kind of chemistry, right? Oh, and once again, what popular science place did they refer to our audience to find out about this study of Neanderthals? IFL Science. Once again, Neanderthals dabbled in chemistry. Ancient glue revealed. Okay, so. That was not Answers in Genesis' response to Homo naledi. In fact, they haven't said anything yet. It's 5 days later, and I predicted they would either not say anything and hope it kind of blows over and just kind of avoid the topic. Or maybe they've assigned it to somebody to do a more in-depth article, in which case it's going to take them a while to prepare. But clearly they're not just immediately responding like they have in the past to some of these articles. And I think they've, as I said in my other video, I think they're going to regret very quickly responding in the past. But there have been 2 other responses by creationists. Now, I'm including intelligent designist in the creationism camp in this case. I usually talk only about young Earth creationism, and I only just dabble a little bit intelligent design. And so Evolution News, which is not a sympathetic site to evolutionary biology, right? This is a way to trick people into thinking that they're learning about evolutionary biology, but actually it's the antithesis of that. So Evolution News has this article, Scientists are skeptical that intelligence in Homo naledi erases human exceptionalism. So their article is actually highlighting the fact that there have been some other scientists that have been skeptical of bits and pieces of the finds that Lee Berger announced. And so they're playing oh, look, there's division among scientists and there's skepticism of some of these results. So therefore, maybe this isn't really a big deal. And this is Casey Luskin who's writing this. And if you know Casey Luskin at all, this is pretty typical fare in terms of the way this article is going to go. It's a lot of distraction, all right? Distract you with this quote, distract you with this quote, not really tell you the full story, and just kind of leave you with this vague impression that everybody kind of disagrees about how to interpret Homo naledi. So therefore, it's fine if you don't have a position or opinion or think this is a big deal. All right, so that's Evolution News and to some extent the intelligent design response to this. Now, we've had another response, and this is from a young Earth creationist. So Institute for Creation Research, Creation Ministries International, Answers in Genesis, so far, not a peep. I haven't seen anything on any social media. I haven't seen anything on their websites. Nothing about Homo naledi at all 6 days into it now. But Todd Wood took it on. All right, Todd Wood, just a day after the news was released, he wrote a blog post interacting with the news about the Homo naledi finds. So graves, engravings, and tools, oh my. And I'll just give you a couple quotes from his blog post. Remember, there was several different findings, so there's actually multiple papers, and Todd Wood does a good job of sort of giving the brief history of Homo naledi, and then he talks about the announcement from 6 months ago, or actually maybe it's a little bit more than that now, that there is evidence of fire use by Homo naledi in the cave, and he rightly points out that Lee Berger had announced that and then said there was going to be a follow-up paper to that describing the details, and that hasn't come out yet. And I have to admit, I wish that had come out as well. Todd Wood's right that we're still waiting to see the evidence on that and for him to back up his assertions. But then he goes into and responds to his reactions to the evidence from the preprint papers. Remember, these aren't peer-reviewed papers yet. These are preprint papers or manuscripts, you can think of them as, that have been released to the public so they can see a good amount of the evidence that he's talking about. And so one of them was about the evidence of burial. And here's what Todd Wood has to say that. Let's start with the burial evidence, which I think is convincing. And I said that too in my video. I said of all the different pieces of evidence that they presented and the types of evidence they presented to support their assertions, I thought that the burial evidence was the best. They report at least 3 different features that contain mostly the bones of one individual in a limited area where the sediments have been disturbed, in which the bones are preserved in particular orientations that require some kind of sediment support during decomposition. In one of these features, they described an oval-shaped mass of sediment with bones oriented vertically close to the edge of the feature. That would make sense if there was a depression in the sediment into which the body was deposited and then covered otherwise. Right, then he goes on and he kind of talks about this. And at the end, you can see here he's saying, this is, whoops. So I'm looking a little bit farther down this paragraph. This is essentially the same evidence we have for various Neanderthal burials. And then a little farther, but as far as ancient human burials go, this evidence from Rising Star is as good or better than most claim for Neanderthal burials. All right, and all young Earth creationists think that Neanderthals are just a population of human beings. Right, and so the evidence for burial for them isn't really any better than it is for Homo naledi in his case. And then, as he points out in that same paper, and this is something I didn't mention in my other video, another feature that authors interpret as a burial contained a rock quite close to the hand of the skeleton. The rock looks suspiciously like something shaped like a tool. The paper refers to this as an artifact. I'm not convinced that it's appropriate. It certainly could be a tool, and frankly, that seems likely. All right, so he's admitting that seems likely, but that entire feature, bones and all, was excavated in 3 blocks of sediment and visualized by synchrotron X-ray scanning. All right, they haven't actually chipped away at this thing and gotten the rock out yet. They've only looked at it from the outside, which is why they don't have the details of the rock in terms of the surface. All right, so that's yet to be remaining, but the possibility is that there was a rock that was some kind of tool actually buried with this particular individual. Like, maybe that represents something, or it's their favorite tool, or whatever, right? Who knows what that is, but it certainly looks like it might be purposefully intended to be put there. All right, so now all that together. The simplest explanation would link the cultural remains directly with the hominid bones present. Homo naledi made the fires, tools, art, and buried their dead in graves. Right? Those are all the things that Lee Berger is suggesting the Homo naledi could do. They could make fires. They potentially had a tool. They had art, these markings on the walls, which Todd Wood goes on to say that that's the least convincing evidence thus far, and I agree. Right? It's circumstantial evidence, and it seems like the simplest explanation, but it's not the only explanation. And then burial, right? All those things together are what being claimed that Homo naledi was capable of. Right? So he says, Todd Wood says, that's the conclusion of the Fuentes et al. Paper, but again, the engravings are not definitively linked to Homo naledi and the fire. We still have a description of the fire evidence, even though it sounds tantalizing. But to argue that someone else made the fires or carved those lines introduces ad hoc hypothesis of cave intruders, for which we have no evidence yet reported. Right? That's another possibility, is that there are individuals that came into the cave later and did things then that we're interpreting as being done by the original individuals that entered. The simplest explanation is that the hominid buried under the engravings next to the hearths is the one who made them. And that would be the simplest definite explanation. As a creationist, so now he's saying, here's my response to this. I see this all fitting together in a very good case for Homo naledi's humanity. These are the sorts of behaviors that I would expect from human beings, and they make sense. Indirect, they may be. But these evidence are the same sorts of evidences I would argue for the humanity of Neanderthals, right? He's got a good point there, right? We don't really know a whole lot more about Neanderthals, though we have a lot of tools from Neanderthals. But lots of little shreds of pieces of evidence that we are putting together and saying that the best explanation for them is, they had these particular cultural capacities and cognitive capacities. I definitely want more. I want to see that rock in the skeleton's hand. That's funny. That's what I said in the video. I said, wouldn't it be it's like, until somebody finds a rock in the hand, right? Maybe actually leaning up against the wall and scratching one of those lines, like in the groove, like that's where they died, That's kind of like, I just want that kind of evidence. I want to see the chemical studies of the engravings. I want to know if there are more and maybe even clearer Homo naledi graves, right? And he's right to want more information, to want more data. But the data he has presented thus far fits what he has said since the very beginning. I didn't cover the part where he said, I did analysis right after Homo naledi came out, and in my analysis, they fit within what he thinks is the human group. And so he is seeing further evidence of that from these newest studies. So every little bit of new information that comes out there seems to continue to conform to, his particular view. Okay, that's it. That's all we have so far in terms of responses to Homo naledi. Still waiting for somebody to respond that doesn't think Homo naledi was human. And what are they going to do with this new data? All right, now we're off to the new creation blog, which is sponsored by Is Genesis History. And there was this really good article written there. I've said it before. I'm going to say it again. There are articles at the New Creation blog in which I agree with virtually everything in it. Like the descriptions of the evidence, the understanding of the context of that evidence is often portrayed very accurately, I think, very fairly. Now, there's a spin in the sense at the end of interpretation of that data that I disagree with. But in terms of the presentation of the data, it's very well done. And in this case, we have the impact of an asteroid is the name of the article. And this is by Christian Ryan. And I've talked about Christian Ryan before. He's an undergraduate student in geology, I think at the University of Maine. And I've heard him talk. It's very articulate. And his writing is excellent. And he has a good grasp of this data. And I'm not going to read this whole article. I'm just going to give you a couple little snippets. Give you a couple tidbits, from this article, just to give you a flavor for some of the detail he's providing his audience, which is like what he's written in this paragraph, I have never seen written on any other creationist site, right? This is the type of data they would ignore, right? They're not going to present this kind of stuff to their audience. And that's what I really appreciate about Christian Ryan and others. They're presenting, here's everything we know. Here's some really interesting things that have been discovered. Observations, right? The facts of the world. These are things that we see, not interpretations. And you need to know about these, even though it's really hard for me to explain them. But here's what scientists have found, and here's what young Earth creationists need to deal with. That's what I appreciate about this. So here we go. Another unusual finding concerns the Cretaceous Paleogene fossil record of plants. Now, of course, let me back up. The asteroid he's talking about, of course, is the asteroid impact from 66 million years ago on the Yucatan Peninsula, right at the KPG boundary. And he doesn't say it in this article, but there are young Earth creationists, specifically those at Institute for Creation Research, which has cast doubt on the very existence of this particular asteroid, that there was an impact at all, and have tried to reinterpret some of the impact site evidence that's come from the Yucatan as something else that happened during the flood. Now, Christian Ryan is very clear in all the verbiage above this that I'm not showing you, that this is reality. There is an asteroid impact. The asteroids have impacted the Earth, and there was a significant impact that had a very large effect, which we can see very clearly in the fossil record. Right, and it's what we call, and what scientists call, this layer at the KPG boundary. That's a real thing. We observe it. Right? So he's acknowledging that. And he's saying another unusual finding there is the fossil record of plants. Pollen grains from angiosperms, fancy name for flowering plants, are quite plentiful in the uppermost Cretaceous rocks. All right, the Cretaceous rocks are the ones that are right below the boundary, right? That's the Cretaceous, the K. However, the KPG boundary represents a turnover where fern spores are found in high concentration. This is an observation from multiple places around the world, that you have Cretaceous flowering plant pollen, and then you have a decrease in flowering plant pollen, and you have a huge spike of fern spores in many, many different locations right above this boundary line. And so, boom, there's all these fern spores. That's a really interesting observation, right? This is evidence of what's called a fern spike. This isn't the only place in the fossil record where there are fern spikes. And there are fern spikes that we observe today, all right, more locally. Fern spikes occur today in areas ecologically devastated by a natural disaster. For example, Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens devastated an area, right? And what grew back first? Ferns, all right? Ferns were survivors through rootstock, and they grew up very quickly, and they produced huge amounts of spores, which then generated a lot more ferns. And so you had this massive fern landscape for a while before other plants that are slower growers, like deciduous trees, began to grow and then cover over those ferns, right? So, but what you have is in the sediments now, you have what's called a fern spike in those sediments. What happened in the aftermath of his example is the Krakatoa in 1883. Ferns were some of the first plants to colonize and dominate the disaster area. The presence of so many fern spores above the KP boundary suggests something similar, but on a massive scale. Like on a worldwide scale, pollen of a certain type decreases in total amount, and fern spores increase. That is a very challenging thing for young Earth creationists to explain if you're going to say, especially for Institute for Creation Research, which says the KPG boundary is just in the flood. I mean, it's just in the middle of the flood because they think the flood boundary is like way higher. So the Earth is covered with water, and then there's this thin layer of stuff laid down, and the rock below it has more angiosperm pollen, and then right above it there's like lots of fern spores. Like, how do fern spores get all laid out and sorted out in this one location? These are observations made by paleontologists all over the world that have to be explained by whatever your viewpoint is of what the history of the world is. Right, so and then he's saying, well, we got to confront this now. What does this mean? Creationism and the Chicks Club impact. Creationism and the, I always pronounce it wrong, impact. So this pact was a very real event in our planet's past. So here's Christian Ryan just saying it right out. It's a real event. Now, this is a direct contradiction to other young Earth creationists, this statement. This is why it's a very important statement to make. How can we understand it within young Earth creationist paradigm? So he's saying the data is so compelling. You put all that stuff together, and there had to have been an impact, right? So it's a real event. Whether you can't deny it. So, but what do? right? So we have to do something with that. This is a real thing that we have to explain. Unfortunately, we have very little young Earth literature published on the impact. During the proceedings of International Conference of Creationism in 1998, Thomas Fritsch published a paper detailing certain areas within the impact that are relevant to young Earth paradigm. Fritsch pointed out that the impact by itself poses no problems for young Earth creationism. I mean, there's been other impacts in the world, and the idea that something would strike the Earth is not necessarily a problem itself. But, all right, because, of course, they believe in radical upheavals of the Earth, right? Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanism, all that is associated with the flood. Why not a couple large asteroids like whacking it too? In combination with the rest of the geological record. However, it does pose some challenges to us. This is a healthy part of the scientific process. It encourages us to be more carefully study the data and understand it more fully. Right? It's acknowledging there's a problem here. What about the flood? Most young geologists need to contend with the asteroid impact that left a thin layer of impact debris simultaneously all around the world. Yes, exactly. There's a huge impact, spewed stuff up in the atmosphere, it landed all over the world and settled out into this thin layer everywhere. This would entail the formation of ejecta debris cloud within the matter of weeks, and then the dissension of the debris within months, while not taking millions of years. Right, this isn't a million years process in terms of making this layer of sediment, but it's not a single day event either. Right, and the calculations have been done. All this has been modeled, the impact, the debris in the atmosphere, how long it would take to circle the globe, the fires that would occur, that putting up soot, that soot has to fall down, right? We're talking about many, many days, but actually more like weeks and months of time for the major parts, the glass sphericals and so forth to fall out in different places. Much less the longer term impacts, which would be years in the making. So while not taking millions of years, the process still requires time to elapse. It's not instantaneous. Perhaps 1 to 3 years, which of course is way too long for the 1 year long flood. And that particular location in the rock record, we have thousands of feet of rock record. You have to explain this one little thin layer. You don't have months even to explain that one layer because you have to lay down all the rest of it as well in that short period of time. So this is a huge problem for young Earth creationism. Another seemingly difficulty is how asteroids could leave impact debris on dry land surfaces. See, there are locations that look like they were dry land based on the plants and the ferns and so forth. How is that explained? Well, Dr. Andrew Snelling points out that during the flood, there were big tides and tsunamis, and so water was moving around, but it wasn't all covered. The whole Earth wasn't covered with water at one time. There was like areas of land, not necessarily dry land, though. All right. Snelling that's an ad hoc, hopeful hypothesis, and Ryan throws that in there as like here's a possibility, but he's going to admit that needs a lot of study, and it's not necessarily compelling, but it's all we got, all right, to explain this at this point. All right, so that's it for this week in creationism. I did want to tell you about a couple coming attractions on the channel. I'm going to talk a little bit more about NUMS. So these are pieces of the mitochondrial genome from the mitochondrion that have been moved and inserted into the nucleus. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the frequency of these pieces that have been transported into the nucleus. We're going to see how many of those are found in species, within species, like within individuals, like how many of these do you have? How many pieces of your mitochondrial genome or human mitochondrial genome do you have just in your nuclear DNA? How many does the whole species have? How many do species have between species? And how many do we share between species? Because many species share exactly the same pieces of mitochondrial DNA in their nuclear genome. So what's the significance of that? We'll talk about that more. I've got a couple more episodes of flood geology failures. One of them I'm particularly excited about talking about, which is are paleontologists faking history? Can paleontologists reconstruct like what a situation may have looked like at a certain time in the past? And when they draw those reconstructions, are they faking history? Are they making it up? Because they must be if young Earth creationism is correct. because those ecological situations they're drawing never existed, right? The way that young Earth creationists have to describe the history of the world. Another flood geology failure, we're going to talk about a weird case of human footprints that have been found in the roof of a cave in South Africa along the coast. How did that come to be? What's the significance of that? I have a creation critique of what if most of what God created is extinct? How does that affect young Earth creationist view of the future? I really want to talk about young Earth creationist views of environmentalism and whether it's important to preserve species or not when you consider the rate at which species are going extinct. And we talk about weaving, I think, general consensus view of science that there's a lot of extinction going on. But if you're a young Earth creationist, you believe in vastly more extinction than most others do. And so I want to try to show you how, if you believe in a young Earth or an old Earth, some people say like, it doesn't matter. That's just history. And if you want to believe the world was young, it doesn't have any impact on what you think today. But actually it does. It affects how you view the future of species, right? Right? What are their future prospects? And what should we do about species today? And then lastly, I'm working up a video on my visit to a local creation museum. There's a creation museum not far from me. And I just visited it today, actually. And I took a bunch of pictures, and I found it really fascinating. There's some really interesting displays there. It's kind of like going back to the 1990s and seeing what creationists said back then, because there's a lot of old displays that are, even many young Earth creationists would say, are highly inaccurate. And so that makes it kind of a fascinating thing. But I want to talk about the whole business of small creation museums and how they persist and who are their clientele. So I'll have a lot to say about that in my visit to the local creation museum video. So those are just a few things that I'm working on that you'll be seeing in the coming weeks. All right. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. If you're still watching this video, well, congratulations. You've successfully made it through one of my videos. But seriously, I want to express my gratitude, for you choosing to spend your valuable time with me. Your support really does mean the world to me. I've been creating these videos, and it's been a remarkable experience. Not only because I had the opportunity to maybe share some of my knowledge and insights with you, but also because I consider myself a perpetual learner. By making videos, I am learning along the way. And I would say that I am in a relationship with you, the viewer. Together we're embarking on this lifelong journey of exploration, right? We're delving into the wonders of the physical universe and beyond. So if you found value in the content that I shared today, I'd really appreciate it if you could show your appreciation by, give me a little like and a follow. Your feedback also and your engagement are really essential to me, and it helps me improve and to grow, as I said. So best wishes to you wherever you might be and whatever you might be doing right now. Take care and God bless. Bye-bye.